It didn't arrive with an announcement. There was no knock on the door, no formal briefing, no warning whispered through the corridors of Northville Palace. It came the way the most dangerous information always does in the modern world, as a single encrypted notification flashing silently across the internal royal network. Medical status confirmed. Immediate action required. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, within seconds, phones began vibrating behind closed doors. Senior aides froze mid-conversation. A security officer stopped walking halfway down the east wing, staring at his screen as if he'd just read something he wasn't supposed to see. The palace didn't erupt into chaos. It did something far more unsettling. It went quiet. Not the calm, ceremonial silence the monarchy was famous for. This was different. This was the kind of silence that spreads when people realize a line has been crossed, when something has surfaced that was never meant to exist outside a locked room. Meetings scheduled weeks in advance were abruptly canceled. Private offices were sealed. Entire floors of the palace were cleared under vague instructions about internal security protocols. No one outside a handful of people knew what the message actually said, but everyone could feel its weight. Because this wasn't a rumor drifting in from tabloids. It wasn't speculation or a leak or gossip from the press. This was internal, verified, time-stamped, marked with the highest level of confidentiality the royal system allowed. The kind of message that bypassed public relations, legal teams, and damage control and went straight to the people who made real decisions. A diagnosis, long discussed only in whispers, had just been officially confirmed. And the most terrifying part wasn't what it said. It was when it arrived. Why now? Why today? Why without preparation? Staff members who had served the crown for decades would later admit they had never seen a notification trigger this level of disruption. Not during abdications, not during scandals, not even during international crises. This felt different. This felt personal, like the palace itself had been caught off guard by its own secret. Behind locked doors, senior officials began asking the same unspoken question. How long has this been buried? If you enjoyed this breakdown and want to stay locked in on all the latest NFL drama, make sure you hit that like button. It helps the video reach more people who love this content just like you. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another update, reaction, or storyline as it unfolds in real time. I also want to hear from you in the comments. What do you think about ShedeurSanders' performance and the Browns' collapse? Drop your thoughts below and let's talk about it. And don't forget to share this video with friends who follow the NFL. Your support truly keeps the channel moving forward. Because suddenly, small things that once seemed meaningless started to feel connected. The youngest royal's recent absence from public appearances. The last-minute cancellations labeled as private family matters. The carefully controlled camera angles during the few times he had been seen. What had once looked like normal privacy now felt engineered. Every missed appearance. Every vague statement. Every carefully worded excuse. They all began collapsing into a single possibility. Inside the family, reactions fractured instantly. The child's mother reportedly cut off all communication, retreating into complete isolation as the reality she had carried alone for years finally broke through the walls of secrecy. The heir to the throne became unreachable, vanishing from internal channels, prompting fears not just about the child, but about what this revelation could do to the future of the entire institution. And then came the most dangerous question of all. If this diagnosis was confirmed now, who forced it into the light? Was it a doctor who finally broke under the weight of silence? A staff member who could no longer live with the lie? Or had the palace simply lost control of its own secrets? Because this notification didn't just reveal a medical truth. It exposed a story the monarchy had never intended the world to hear. And whatever was written inside, that message wasn't just about health. It was about power, legacy, and a secret so volatile that even the crown itself seemed unprepared for what came next. Royal children disappear from the public eye all the time. It's almost expected. One month they're waving from balconies, the next they're focusing on school or spending time privately with family. So when the youngest heir slowly stopped appearing at public events, it barely registered as unusual. In fact, most people assumed it was a good thing, a rare moment of normalcy in a life built around cameras and protocol. But absence has a way of revealing itself over time. The missed appearances started to stack up. National celebrations where all senior family members were present, except him. Holiday services where his siblings walked ahead, while his name was quietly removed from the official program. Charity events where his seat remained empty, explained away with the same vague line every time. Private family matters. It sounded harmless, responsible even. No one questioned it because no one was supposed to. The palace never offered details, and the media, conditioned by decades of royal discretion, didn't push. There were no headlines, no outrage, just a subtle shift in who the public saw and who they didn't. And that's exactly what made it work. The disappearances weren't sudden. They were gradual, so gradual that they blended into the background of royal life. One appearance turned into 3 missed events. 3 turned into months. Months turned into an entire year where the youngest royal existed only through old photos and carefully curated statements. What made it even stranger was how precise it all felt. When he did appear, it was brief. A few seconds on camera, always surrounded by adults, always guided, always positioned slightly behind his siblings, as if the palace itself was trying to reduce his visibility without making it obvious. There were no candid moments, no unexpected interactions, no unscripted footage. Every glimpse felt rehearsed. And yet, the public didn't notice. Because nothing was technically wrong. There was no official announcement, no confirmed issue, just a child who seemed to be around less. And in a world where celebrities vanish from social media every other week, that hardly felt alarming. But inside the palace, it was anything but normal. Internal schedules were being rewritten. Security protocols quietly adjusted. Press teams were instructed to avoid direct questions about him altogether. If his name came up, the answer was always the same: education, privacy, family time. No variations, no elaboration. Just silence, repeated so consistently that it stopped sounding natural. And that's the unsettling part. The disappearances weren't about protecting a child from the public. They were about controlling what the public was allowed to see. Because by the time people started realizing how long it had been since they'd truly seen him, the pattern was already complete. The youngest royal hadn't simply stepped back from public life. He had been slowly, carefully, and almost invisibly removed from it. Once people started paying attention, they couldn't unsee it. Old footage began resurfacing online, short clips from public appearances, family walkabouts, holiday events that had once seemed ordinary. But now, watched through a different lens, those moments felt unsettling. Not because anything dramatic happened on screen, but because of how subtle everything was. In one clip, the youngest royal hesitates before stepping forward, as if unsure of where he is meant to stand. An adult gently adjusts his position, guiding him into frame. At the time, it looked like normal stage management. Now, it felt more like intervention. In another, he stumbles slightly while walking across a courtyard. His mother reaches for his hand almost instantly, steadying him before anyone else notices. The media had dismissed it as playful clumsiness, but rewatched today, the movement doesn't look playful at all. It looks cautious, controlled. Then there were the pauses. During a rare interview, he takes longer than expected to answer a simple question. His eyes shift briefly toward someone off camera before he speaks, as if waiting for a signal. The moment passed unnoticed when it first aired, but in hindsight, that glance felt rehearsed. Even his gestures began to look different. When waving, his movements were small, limited, almost rigid. When standing for long periods, he subtly leaned into whoever was closest to him. And whenever cameras stayed on him for more than a few seconds, An adult would quickly step in, redirecting attention, changing the angle, moving him out of focus. Individually, none of these moments meant anything. That's why they worked. They were easy to explain away. Kids get tired. Kids lose focus. Kids trip. Kids forget what to say. But taken together, the patterns started to feel deliberate, like every appearance had been designed around minimizing exposure rather than encouraging it. Behind the scenes, insiders would later claim staff were given coded language to describe what they called fatigue episodes. A harmless phrase, but one that was used far too often and applied far too selectively. Certain events were canceled at the last minute. Certain appearances were cut short without explanation. And any staff member who asked too many questions was quietly reminded of their confidentiality agreements. One former aide, speaking anonymously, described being reprimanded simply for suggesting the child might need additional rest after a long event. Not for breaking protocol, not for leaking information, just for asking. That was the first red flag. Then came the departures. A longtime tutor suddenly resigned. A personal assistant transferred to another wing. A nanny who had been considered essential vanished from palace records entirely. Officially, they all left for personal reasons. Unofficially, no one was allowed to talk about why. And that's when the signs stopped feeling accidental. Because the most telling detail wasn't what the public saw. It was how aggressively the palace controlled what they didn't. What the public never saw was what had already been unfolding deep inside the palace walls. Buried within a restricted wing of Northvale's internal archives was a file that didn't exist on any official registry. No digital footprint, no searchable records, just a code name known only to a handful of senior figures and medical advisors. Project Solstice. It didn't begin with panic. It began with patterns. Private physicians started noticing repeated symptoms they couldn't easily explain. Moments of disorientation, delayed responses, subtle motor irregularities that didn't align with normal development. At first, everything was labeled as temporary, stress, fatigue, growth phases. But as the data accumulated, denial became impossible. By the time the youngest royal was barely 3 years old, internal doctors had quietly escalated the case. What followed wasn't a standard medical process. It was the construction of a classified operation disguised as routine royal healthcare. Reports were rewritten in coded language. Test results were split across multiple departments, so no single file contained the full picture. Even the public-facing physicians were gradually replaced with specialists who answered directly to palace officials instead of medical boards. Then came the international experts. Not through official channels, not under their real names. A pediatric neurologist flown in from Scandinavia under a diplomatic cover. A neurogenetic researcher from Canada listed as a cultural consultant. A specialist from the Middle East whose travel records were sealed under national security protocols. Each of them signed lifetime non-disclosure agreements before ever seeing the patient. None of their work was published. None of their findings were shared externally. And none of them were allowed to leave behind documentation. But behind closed doors, their conclusions aligned. The condition was rare, degenerative, unpredictable. In some cases, patients remained stable for years. In others, symptoms accelerated rapidly with little warning. There was no confirmed cure, only monitoring, management, and a growing list of unknowns. For a normal family, it would have been devastating. For a monarchy built on continuity, symbolism, and perceived strength, it was catastrophic. Because this wasn't just a medical issue, it was a political one. A future royal whose cognitive or motor abilities could decline meant uncertainty in the line of succession. It meant vulnerability. It meant headlines the palace could never control. So they made a decision. The project would remain secret. The diagnosis would never reach Parliament. No official report would be filed. No external ethics board would be informed. Everything would stay inside the institution, governed by royal protocol instead of medical transparency. Project Solstice became less about treatment and more about containment. Not of the condition, but of the truth. For years, the system worked because everyone inside it agreed to play their role. Doctors followed protocol, aides followed instructions, staff followed silence. The palace functioned like a sealed ecosystem where information flowed upward, never outward, and for a long time no one broke the pattern. Until one person did. They weren't a senior advisor, not a physician, not even a public figure, just a low-level support aide assigned to the youngest royal's daily routine, the kind of position designed to be invisible, present but unnoticed, trusted but replaceable. That's what made them dangerous. Because unlike the officials who only saw reports and summaries, this aide saw everything. The private consultations disguised as routine checkups, the whispered conversations between doctors in restricted hallways, the way schedules were constantly rewritten around medical needs that were never spoken out loud. They noticed patterns long before the public did. Medication administered at precise times, sudden behavioral shifts that were carefully documented, then quietly dismissed. Entire days where the child was kept away from everyone except a tightly controlled circle of adults. Even the smallest details were managed: how long he could be on camera, which questions he could answer, when he was allowed to speak at all. At first, the aide told themselves it wasn't their place to question anything. Then they started keeping notes. Nothing dramatic, just dates, times, observations, canceled events, unusual instructions. But over months, the notes turned into a record, a timeline of inconsistencies that no longer felt accidental. What disturbed them most wasn't the condition itself. It was the emotional cost. They watched the child's mother linger by his bedside long after lights out, pretending to read while quietly wiping away tears. They overheard arguments between advisors about how much the public needed to know. They witnessed moments where the child was gently coached before appearances, reminded where to stand, what to say, how long to smile. Even his gestures felt rehearsed. The aide realized they weren't supporting a child anymore. They were supporting a narrative. The final breaking point came during a closed-door meeting they weren't meant to hear. Senior officials discussed the possibility of relocating the child abroad for long-term care, framed as a logistical solution rather than a human one. No mention of family, no mention of emotional impact, just risk management. That night, the aide made a decision. Using a secure external network, they sent a single encrypted file to an international medical ethics group. Inside were months of notes, internal schedules, and one simple message. This isn't treatment, it's suppression. They didn't ask for fame. They didn't reveal their name. They didn't even expect anyone to believe them. They just couldn't carry the silence anymore. And with that one message, a secret that had been buried for years finally escaped the walls of the palace. Behind the controlled statements and carefully curated appearances, the real battle wasn't happening in meeting rooms or medical offices. It was happening in private. From the outside, she looked composed, always presentable, always smiling when cameras were near. The kind of figure the public associated with stability and grace. But inside the palace, her reality was unraveling in ways no protocol could manage. Because she wasn't just watching a crisis unfold. She was living inside it. For years, she carried the truth almost alone. While advisors discussed optics and doctors spoke in clinical language, she experienced everything through the raw instinct of a parent. Every unexplained symptom, every test result that came back inconclusive, every whispered conversation in hallways that stopped the moment she entered. She began keeping her own private records. Not official reports, not medical charts, personal notes, observations, questions no one else seemed willing to ask. In the margins, she wrote things like, "He seems confused today," or "He forgot what we did yesterday." Small sentences that meant nothing to anyone else but meant everything to her. At night, when the palace went quiet, she stayed awake. Not because of duty, because of fear. Fear that she was missing something. Fear that time was slipping away. Fear that decisions were being made about her child without her truly being part of them. The doctors spoke about monitoring. The advisors spoke about timing. But no one spoke about what it felt like to watch your own child slowly become a problem that needed to be managed. The tension reached a breaking point when experimental options were introduced. Treatments that weren't fully approved, procedures that came with more uncertainty than reassurance. They were framed as innovative and forward-thinking, but she saw something else entirely, a system willing to gamble with her child for the sake of maintaining control. She refused. Not quietly, not politely, she pushed back in meetings, questioned the specialists, challenged advisors who had never once asked how her son felt about any of it. Her resistance caused friction almost immediately. Protocol was being disrupted. Decisions were being delayed, and for the first time, the institution felt her presence as an obstacle instead of an asset. So she made a move no one expected. She began pulling him away. Fewer appearances, fewer official commitments. Eventually, she withdrew him entirely from the environments most closely tied to royal oversight. Schools, programs, events designed to shape him into a public symbol. Her message was simple, even if she never said it out loud. He wasn't a future role. He was a child. And if protecting him meant quietly standing against the very system she had married into, she was prepared to do exactly that, even if it meant fighting the monarchy from the inside, one silent decision at a time. For a long time, he believed he understood the situation. Not in detail, but enough to trust that it was being handled, that the specialists were competent, that the advisors were honest, that the system built around him was doing what it always claimed to do: protect the family, protect the future, protect the crown. But the truth didn't reach him through an official briefing. It reached him by accident. Late one night, in a restricted archive he wasn't supposed to access, he found a report that hadn't been filtered. Not summarized, not softened. A raw internal file that hadn't gone through legal review or public relations. It wasn't written for optics. It was written for accuracy. And it changed everything. The condition was more severe than he'd been told. The timelines were shorter. The uncertainties far greater. Entire sections of the report referenced evaluations he had never been informed about. Consultations he didn't know existed. Decisions made without his knowledge. He wasn't angry at first. He was stunned. Then the realization hit. He hadn't been protected. He had been managed. The people he trusted most, senior advisors, medical liaisons, even members of his own inner circle, had curated the truth, presenting him with a version of reality that was easier to control, easier to accept, easier to live with. And that betrayal cut deeper than any diagnosis ever could. The confrontation that followed was explosive. Behind closed doors, voices were raised in a way they rarely were inside the palace. He demanded explanations. They offered justifications: national stability, public perception, long-term strategy, phrases designed to sound responsible while avoiding the one thing he wanted: honesty. The backlash wasn't loud because people hated the monarchy. It was loud because people finally realized they'd been watching a story with missing pages, and now they wanted to read the parts they were never meant to see. By the time the noise began to fade, nothing actually felt resolved. The palace was still standing, the statements were still vague, the documentaries were still unreleased, the insiders were still anonymous. On the surface, life returned to something that looked like normal. But the feeling didn't go away. Because once people notice a pattern, they can't unsee it. Every new public appearance of the royal family was now analyzed differently. Every smile felt rehearsed. Every absence felt intentional. Even moments that had nothing to do with the youngest heir were suddenly viewed through the same lens. What aren't we being shown? What's happening off camera? And who decides what the public is allowed to know? That's what made this story linger. There was no final reveal, no single clip that exposed everything. No dramatic confession that tied all the threads together. Just a growing sense that the truth existed somewhere between official silence and online speculation. And that space, the gap between what's said and what's hidden, became the real story. Some believe the palace did what it had to do. That protecting privacy, especially involving a child, justifies secrecy. That not every personal struggle needs to become a public spectacle. Others think that explanation is too convenient. Because this wasn't just about privacy. It was about presentation, about shaping reality, about deciding which versions of people are acceptable enough to be seen and which ones are quietly removed from the frame. The most unsettling part. No one can prove either side completely wrong. There's no document that confirms a cover-up. There's no evidence that fully clears the institution either. Just patterns, timing, behavior, and a trail of carefully managed silence. And that's why this story refuses to end. Not because of what we know, but because of what we don't. Because somewhere inside that palace, behind protocols and advisors and closed doors, there's a version of this story that exists in full. A version the public will probably never hear in one clean piece. Maybe nothing truly sinister happened. Maybe everything was exaggerated by the internet. Maybe this is just what happens when powerful institutions collide with modern transparency. Or maybe the truth is simpler and darker. That sometimes the biggest secrets aren't hidden with lies. They're hidden with silence. And the question that now haunts everything isn't about one royal child. It's about the system itself. If an institution has the power to decide what reality looks like for millions of people, if it can edit, frame, and control its own narrative for decades, then how many other stories have we already accepted? Not because they were true, but because they were the only versions we were ever allowed to see.
If you enjoyed today's breakdown and want to keep up with all the drama, trades, and behind-the-scenes action in the NFL, then don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps this channel grow and lets us know you love this kind of content. And hey, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with your friends, your group chats, or anyone who loves football as much as you do. The more the conversation spreads, the better it gets. Most importantly, if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the channel and tap the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss when we drop fresh stories, wild rumors, or breaking updates that the mainstream media won't talk about.